The sun clawed its way over the jagged peaks of Bitter Creek, New Mexico, scorching the cracked earth, where dust devils spun like restless ghosts, carrying the whispers of broken dreams. The town huddled in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, its adobe shacks bleached to the hue of old bones, their roofs sagging under the weight of time. At the heart of Bitter Creek stood the Rusty Spurs Saloon, a weathered husk reeking of sour whiskey, stale tobacco, and the faint tang of desperation. Clara Boone poured drinks behind the bar, her hands steady, despite years of serving men who wagered their lives on bad horses and worse luck. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, missed nothing, not the drunks slurring boasts, nor the quiet ones hiding secrets in their shadows. At a corner table, Doc Elias Grayson shuffled a deck of cards, as worn as his conscience, his gray beard stained with cigar ash, his eyes heavy with the burden of stitching wounds that never healed the heart. "Another fool rode out this morning," Clara said, wiping a glass with a rag that had long surrendered to grime. "That's 40 now, all thinking they'd tame that devil horse." Sheriff Amos Caldwell looked up from his beer, his badge glinting in the dim lamplight, like a warning. 40 men, each one swearing he'd be the one to break that beast. Pride's a hell of a drug, but it ain't stronger than a ton of pure fury. They spoke of the creature 3 miles out of town on the sprawling Henshaw Ranch, where widow Abigail Henshaw ruled with a will forged in fire and tempered by loss. Her husband Silas had been dead 2 years, killed in what the town called a riding accident. Some whispered she'd mourned too little, moving on too fast, but those who knew her saw a woman who'd carried the ranch's weight long before Silas's last breath. The ranch house stood proud on a rise, its whitewashed walls stark against the endless brown of the desert, rebuilt after a fire claimed the original. Every beam was placed with the precision of a woman who trusted no one but herself. Wide porches offered shade and a view of the 25,000 acres stretching to the mountains, a kingdom hard-won and fiercely guarded, its fences weathered but unyielding. The real draw, though, was the corral out back, built of oak, thick as a man's thigh, and banded with iron, standing 9 feet high to cage a black stallion named Tempest. At 18 hands, Tempest was a storm of muscle, and his coat gleaming like polished obsidian, his eyes burning with a wild intelligence that made men rethink their courage. Born on the ranch, sired by a rogue Mustang that breached the fences under a blood-red moon, Tempest had defied every attempt to break him since he was a colt. Silas had tried, first using brutal methods passed down from his father, whips, spurs, and ropes meant to crush spirit. The result, a horse that shunned human touch and a trail of broken men, 3 scarred for life, their bodies as mangled as their pride. After Silas's death, Abigail issued a challenge that echoed through the territory like a gunshot. Spend 1 month with Tempest. Use any method you like. Ride him 3 times around the corral without being thrown, and you'd earn 200 and the respect of every soul from here to Texas. Fail and you'd join the 40 men who'd learned some spirits couldn't be tamed by force. They'd tried everything: whips that drew blood, spurs that gouged, ropes that burned, even kindness laced with desperation and deceit. Tempest threw them all, rearing and bucking until they hit the dirt or limped away, their egos ground into the dust like ash. The morning of the 40th attempt dawned hotter than a blacksmith's forge, the air thick with the promise of a storm. Abigail watched from her porch as Caleb Dutton, a brash wrangler from Arizona with a reputation for breaking anything with 4 legs, swaggered into the corral. His spurs jangled, his grin wide with the confidence of a man who'd never met a horse he couldn't conquer. Tempest sent him sprawling within the hour, his body cartwheeling through the dust, his curses swallowed by the wind. By noon, Caleb was hobbling back to town, his hat crumpled, his pride shattered. Abigail felt a strange mix of triumph and weariness. Part of her wanted Tempest tamed to prove the world could be mastered. Another part, the part that knew what it was to fight for survival, to claw your way out of darkness, admired his refusal to bend. That evening, as the sky bled crimson and the first stars pierced the dusk, Abigail sat on her porch with a glass of wine, her thoughts drifting to trust and the men who'd never earned it. Her wedding ring turned inward to hide the diamond pressed against her finger, a reminder of a marriage that had been more cage than vow. A dust cloud appeared on the horizon, small at first, growing larger as a lone rider approached. He was different from the others. Where they'd been loud with bluster, their spurs jingling like boasts, he was quiet, his movements deliberate, almost reverent. His horse, a plain dun mare named Sage, carried a saddle older than most of Bitter Creek's children, its leather scratched and scarred by claws, perhaps or bullets. His clothes were clean but threadbare, his hat low over eyes that held secrets he didn't offer. He dismounted with the ease of a man born to the saddle, removing his hat to reveal a face carved by grief lines etched deep around eyes that had seen too much, a mouth more used to silence than speech. "Ma'am," he said, his voice soft with a drawl that carried no boast, only a quiet resolve. "Heard you got a horse that needs a different kind of hand." Abigail studied him from her chair, her wine glass still in hand. He stood balanced, not aggressive, holding his hat respectfully, but not groveling. His eyes met hers, steady and unguarded, revealing a depth the others lacked, not pride, but a quiet recognition of pain, as if he'd walked the same shadowed paths she had. "I've got a horse that sent 40 men packing," she said, her voice sharp but curious. "What makes you think you'll fare better?" His gaze didn't waver, and for a moment she saw something flicker in his eyes. Grief, yes, but also a spark of hope. "Maybe I won't," he said, "but I'd like to try." Abigail set her wine down the glass, clinking softly against the table. "Your name, stranger?" "Jack Colton, ma'am. Got no place else to be." As the stars thickened in the sky, Abigail nodded, a decision made on instinct. "Well, Jack Colton, you can sleep in the bunkhouse tonight. Tomorrow you meet Tempest. But I warn you, he's got a memory like a grudge and a temper like a cornered rattler." Jack settled his hat back on the brim, casting a shadow over his face. "Ma'am, the things worth having usually come with a fight. Sometimes that fight's just about listening." Abigail watched him lead Sage to the barn. His steps measured his shoulders, carrying an invisible weight. A flicker of something unfamiliar stirred in her chest. Curiosity, perhaps, or the first faint stirrings of trust. Tempest stood at the corral's edge, his silhouette sharp against the starlit sky, watching the newcomer with what might have been curiosity or defiance. She shook off the thought and went inside, sensing that Jack Colton was about to make her life either unforgettable or unbearable. In the bunkhouse, Jack spread his bedroll on a creaky cot, the wood groaning under his weight. His gaze drifted to the corral where Tempest's shadow loomed like a challenge. From his saddlebag, he pulled a worn leather pouch holding a faded photograph, a woman with gentle eyes and a boy with a gap-toothed grin, both lost to a fire that had burned more than his home. He traced the image with a calloused finger, whispering a prayer for redemption, hoping this wild horse might bring him closer to peace. The photograph was all he had left of Mary and little Ben, and it was both anchor and wound, tethering him to a past he couldn't escape. Dawn broke over the Henshaw ranch, painting the sky in hues of fire and gold. Jack stood at the corral, coffee in hand, studying Tempest. The stallion's coat gleamed like polished obsidian, his muscles rippling with barely contained power, his eyes tracking every movement with a predator's focus. This wasn't just a horse, this was a force unbroken by 40 failures, a creature that carried the wildness of the desert in his bones. "He's something, ain't he?" Abigail's voice came from behind, soft but clear, cutting through the morning stillness. She approached in a plain gray dress, her coffee steaming in the cool air, her hair pinned back but loose enough to catch the breeze. "My husband called him the devil's own, sent to break men's souls." Jack glanced at her, noting the strength in her posture, tempered by a softness in her eyes that she guarded carefully. "What do you think he is?" Abigail's gaze stayed on Tempest, her expression unreadable. "A creature that's only known pain, dressed as kindness. Makes him dangerous but honest. You always know where you stand with him." Jack nodded, hearing more than just talk of horses. Her words carried the weight of her own scars, and he recognized the language of someone who'd learned to survive by building walls. "How long's he been this way?" "Since he was weaned," she said, her voice low. "Silas tried to break him with force, whips, spurs, the works, made him wilder. Every man since has done the same, whips, fear, even sweet talk. That was just a mask for control." Her words held old wounds, and Jack sensed she wasn't only speaking of Tempest. "Submission through fear ain't submission," Jack said, his voice steady. "It's just survival playing dress-up." Abigail's gaze sharpened, catching something in him she hadn't expected, understanding, not judgment. "Most men don't get that." Jack looked back at Tempest, who'd edged closer, drawn by his stillness, his ears flicking with cautious curiosity. "I'd like to try something different if you're willing." Abigail's laugh was dry like the rustle of tumbleweeds. 40 men tried different. "What's your trip?" Jack pulled a battered harmonica from his pocket, its surface worn smooth by years of use, its metal glinting faintly in the dawn light. "No trick, just a conversation." He lifted the harmonica and played a slow, mournful tune, the notes drifting like a breeze across the corral, carrying the weight of the desert's loneliness. Tempest's ears flickered forward, his body easing the tension in his muscles softening. He stepped closer, cautious but not hostile, until he stood 10 feet away, his head tilted as if waiting for the next note. Abigail's breath caught her coffee forgotten. I'll be damned. Jack lowered the harmonica, moving to the fence with deliberate calm, his boots scuffing softly in the dirt. Easy, boy. He murmured, his voice as gentle as the music, a low drawl that seemed to blend with the wind. Ain't nobody hurting you today. Tempest's eyes tracked him, wary but curious, his nostrils flaring as he caught Jack's scent. When Jack reached the fence, he stood still, letting the horse decide the next move. After a long, tense moment, Tempest stretched his neck, his breath warm against Jack's outstretched hand. The stallion's muscles quivered, ready to bolt, but he stayed, his eyes locked on Jack's. That's it, Jack said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. You choose how close we get. Abigail watched mesmerized as Jack let Tempest set the pace. This was the opposite of every attempt she'd witnessed: respect instead of dominance, patience instead of force. Tempest stepped back, but not far, his head still turned toward Jack, watching with something like interest. That's enough for today, Jack said, turning away from the fence, his movements unhurried. Trust takes time. Abigail followed him toward the barn, her boots crunching on the gravel path. The others tried to ride him day one, she said. Some even managed a few seconds before he threw him. Jack paused at the barn door, his hand resting on the weathered wood. Getting on a horse ain't riding him, and riding ain't partnering. I ain't here to break Tempest. I'm here to earn him. Her eyes searched his face, catching the grief etched in the lines around his mouth, the weight in his gaze. What happened to you, Jack? What taught you this? Jack's gaze drifted to the horizon where the mountains stood like silent sentinels. Learn that force don't fix what's broken. Sometimes the things we call broken are just guarding themselves the only way they know. He stepped into the barn but paused, turning back to her. Miss Abigail, I'll need to spend time with Tempest every day, just being there. Might look like nothing, but trust is invisible till it's tested. Abigail finished his thought, surprising herself with the ease of it, till it's tested. Jack's lips twitched in what might have been a smile, the first she'd seen from him. Yes, ma'am. As he tended Sage, brushing her coat with care, Abigail lingered at the corral, watching Tempest pace under the rising sun. His movements were less frantic now, his eyes still fixed on the barn where Jack had disappeared. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of curiosity about what might be possible when someone met defiance with patience, when strength was measured not in conquest, but in understanding. Jack's saddle, worn smooth by years of hard riding, bore scratches that looked like claw marks or bullet scars. When Abigail asked about them later that day, as they shared coffee on the porch, his face went blank, his eyes distant. Nothing worth telling, he said, but she knew truth when she heard it, hiding just as she'd hidden her own for years. The second day began with Jack at the corral, coffee in hand, Tempest watching from 20 feet away, his ears swiveling like twin radars. Abigail joined him, her hair pinned back, her dress practical, but worn at the hems, a testament to her years of toil. Sleep well? She asked, her voice lighter than she intended. Jack nodded, though his nights were haunted by flames and screams, the memory of a fire that had taken everything. He's watching me, he said, nodding at Tempest, whose eyes tracked his every move, less hostile than curious, as if weighing Jack's intentions. Good, Jack said, setting his coffee on a post. Means he's thinking. Abigail studied his profile, steady hands scarred from rope and steel, a stillness that spoke of discipline forged in hardship. What did you do before this, Jack? She asked, her curiosity sharper now. His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching faintly. This and that, he said, his voice clipped. She recognized the dodge, having used it herself when asked about Silas. I was married 8 years, she said, surprising herself with the confession. Folks in town think I didn't grieve him right, moved on too fast. Jack glanced at her, his eyes softening. Some marriages are about surviving, not living. Her chest eased at his understanding, as if a weight had shifted. What about you, ever married? His hand brushed his chest where a small shape bulged under his shirt, a locket perhaps, or something more sacred. Once he said the word, heavy with loss, like a stone dropped into a still pond. They stood in silence, watching Tempest circle the corral, his hooves kicking up small clouds of dust. Jack set his coffee down and walked to the barn, returning with a brush and a bucket of oats. He sat on a stump 15 feet from the fence, cleaning the brush with care, his movements deliberate, almost meditative. "What are you doing?" Abigail asked, leaning against the fence. "Showing him I ain't in a hurry," Jack said, humming a low tune, the same mournful melody from his harmonica. Tempest's ears pricked, and he stopped circling, drawn by the rhythm, his head tilting, as if deciphering a message. "Music calms him," Abigail said, her voice soft with wonder. "Most horses," Jack replied, his hand still working the brush. "They're prey animals, always listening for danger. Music says it's safe." Abigail felt the moment's peace drawn to Jack's quiet confidence, the way he seemed to understand both horse and human without forcing either to bend. "Tell me about Silas," Jack said, still brushing, his voice gentle but probing. Her voice dropped, the words coming slow. "Hard man. Hard on the land, the animals, me. Thought that was strength when I was young. Took years to learn it wasn't." Jack nodded, his eyes on the brush. "What changed you?" Her fingers brushed her wedding ring, turned inward, to hide the diamond, a habit born of shame and survival. "He broke a Mustang once. Beautiful creature, full of spirit. He crushed it till there was nothing left but a shell. I didn't want to end up like that, hollow, just going through the motions." Jack set the brush down, his gaze steady. "So you didn't let him break you?" "I built walls," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Kept my real self safe, lonely but alive." Jack stood carrying the oats closer to the corral, his boots crunching softly. "Independence is sweet once you taste it." Tempest caught the scent, his nostrils flaring, his eyes locked on the bucket. Jack sat 10 feet from the fence, letting oats fall through his fingers like sand, the sound a soft patter against the earth. The stallion edged closer, cautious but intrigued, his hooves testing the ground. "Easy, boy," Jack murmured. "We got time." Abigail held her breath as Tempest approached the fence, stopping close enough to sniff the bucket, his breath stirring the air. Jack held out a handful of oats, his arms steady but not reaching, giving the horse the choice. After a tense moment, Tempest lipped the oats from his palm, his touch gentle, almost reverent. Abigail's eyes stung at the sight. Tempest had never let anyone feed him by hand, not even Silas in his better days. "Well done," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jack stayed still as Tempest retreated not far, watching, with interest, his ears still forward. "Small steps," he said, brushing off his hands. "Trust don't come quick." As they walked to the house, Abigail felt a shift, like a crack in the wall she'd built. Like Tempest, she'd learned to guard herself from those who demanded too much, who saw her as something to conquer. Jack's patience was teaching her something new, not just about horses, but about the possibility of trust without betrayal. "Jack," she said at the porch, her voice softer than she meant. He turned and she saw warmth in his eyes, a flicker of something that felt like home. "Thank you." He tipped his hat, his gaze steady. "Early days, ma'am, but we're getting there." That evening, Abigail invited Jack to dinner in the house, a simple meal of cornbread and stew, but she took care with her appearance, choosing a dress that hadn't seen light in years. She told herself it was hospitality, but the mirror told a different story. When Jack arrived clean-shaven and in a fresh shirt, his hair still damp from washing, her heart fluttered, a sensation she'd thought long dead. Their meal was warm, filled with stories of the land and laughter that felt like a new beginning, each word a step towards something neither dared name yet. In his saddlebag, hidden in oilcloth, lay a Silver Star medal, earned in a war that cost Jack his family. Mary and little Ben lost to a fire while he was overseas, fighting battles that meant nothing when he returned to ashes. The medal was a bitter reminder of a hero's title he'd never wanted, a weight he carried as he sought redemption in Bitter Creek, a place where the past might finally loosen its grip. By the end of the first week, Jack's routine with Tempest was yielding results. The stallion no longer fled to the corral's far end, standing 20 feet away, watching with cautious trust, his eyes less wild, more curious. Abigail observed from the kitchen window, drawn to the quiet drama unfolding, the way Jack moved with a patience that seemed to calm the very air around him. Sheriff Caldwell visited on the 7th day, his eyes sharp as he leaned against the porch rail. "That cowboy's got a soldier's bearing," he said, squinting at Jack in the corral, seen it in men who faced death and walked away changed. Abigail pressed, her curiosity piqued. "What makes you say that?" Caldwell shrugged his badge, catching the sunlight. "Just a hunch. Bet he's seen war, maybe worse." The next morning, Jack asked to bring his harmonica into the corral, a bold step after only a week. Abigail hesitated, her hand tightening on her coffee mug, then nodded. "I trust you." Jack stepped inside the corral, the first man to do so without Tempest rearing or charging. He sat 10 feet from the gate, playing the same mournful tune, the notes weaving through the air like a lullaby for the wild. Tempest approached, stopping close enough for his breath to stir the dust, his eyes locked on Jack's. When Jack reached out slow and steady and touched the stallion's neck, Tempest leaned into it, a moment of trust that brought tears to Abigail's eyes, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in years, hope. "Well, I'll be damned," a voice sneered, cutting through the moment like a knife. Abigail turned to see Nate Carver, a ranch hand who'd failed to tame Tempest months ago, leaning against the fence, his eyes narrowed with envy. His boots were caked with mud, his shirt stained with sweat and resentment. "Your pet Cowboy's got tricks, huh?" "It's skill." Nate Abigail snapped, her voice sharp as a whip. "Not tricks." "Any fool can pet a horse," Nate said, spitting into the dust. "Wait till he tries riding him. Tempest will put him in the dirt." Jack stood unruffled, his harmonica still in hand. "Some things can't be rushed, Carver." Nate stalked off, muttering under his breath, his shadow long and jagged in the morning light. "Mark my words, Abigail, that horse will kill him." Jack joined her, his calm unshaken. "Some folks don't see there's more than one way to solve a problem." Abigail invited him to dinner again, and over coffee, as the stars began to burn through the dusk, she asked Caldwell, "Thinks you're ex-military?" "That true." Jack's hands stilled his coffee mug halfway to his lips. "Captain Jack Colton, 5th Cavalry, 8 years mostly in hellholes abroad." "What made you leave?" His voice dropped, the words heavy with memory. "Lost my wife and son in a fire while I was saving strangers. Got a medal for it, but it don't bring 'em back." Abigail reached across the table, her hand resting on his. "That's why you understand Tempest. You know pain." Maybe Jack said, his eyes distant. "Or I just know what it's like to stop trusting." 3 weeks in Tempest was a different horse. He accepted a saddle blanket without flinching, even nuzzled Jack, during grooming, his muzzle brushing Jack's shoulder like a gesture of friendship. Abigail watched from the porch, her heart swelling with pride, and something deeper, something she was afraid to name. On a Thursday, Jack saddled Tempest, the stallion, standing calm as the cinch tightened, his eyes steady, trusting. When Jack leaned across the saddle, testing the weight, Tempest turned to nuzzle his shoulder, a silent agreement between them. "He's ready," Jack said later, as they sat on the porch, the evening air cool against their skin. "For weight in the stirrups, maybe more." Abigail's stomach twisted, a pang of fear cutting through her. Success meant Jack might leave, and the thought of losing him was a wound she hadn't expected. "How long?" "Week or two," he said, reading her fear in the way her hands tightened around her mug. "Depends on him." Doc Grayson arrived that afternoon, his face grim, as he dismounted his wagon, a crumpled letter in his hand. "It's about Silas," he said, his voice low, almost reluctant. "Nate Carver dropped this off last night, drunk and raving. Thought you should see it." Abigail took the letter, her hands trembling as she read. Nate confessed that Silas's death, ruled a horse accident, was murder. Silas had cheated at cards in the Rusty Spur, drawn a gun when called out, and Nate shot him, staging the scene with his cronies to look like Tempest had trampled him. The final lines burned into her mind. "You knew what Silas was, Abigail. We thought we were saving you, but seeing you with that cowboy makes me sick." The letter fell from her hands, fluttering to the porch. Jack picked it up, his jaw tight as he read. "How long you known Doc?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. "Suspected from the start," Grayson admitted, his eyes dropping to the ground. "Injuries didn't add up. Powder burns on Silas's shirt, not hoof marks." "You all knew," Abigail said, her voice breaking, her hands clenching into fists. "Knew he beat me, knew he was a monster, and you did nothing." "We thought you wouldn't leave," Grayson said, his voice heavy with guilt. "Thought he'd hurt you worse if we stepped in." "Get out!" Abigail screamed, her voice raw with betrayal. "Get off my land!" As Grayson's wagon faded into the dust, Abigail sank into a chair, the world crumbling around her. Jack knelt beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "This don't change who you are," he said. "You're not his choices." "I stayed," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. 8 years of excuses, of hiding bruises. What does that make me?" "A survivor," Jack said, his voice steady, his eyes holding hers. "Same as me, same as Tempest." She looked at him, seeing compassion without judgment, a man who understood her pain because he carried his own. "How do you know this pain?" "My father beat my mother," Jack said, his voice low. The words pulled from a deep wound. "I was 15 when I stopped him, put him in the dirt. She never left, died believing she'd failed him. Surviving ain't weak, Abigail. It's strength, the kind that don't break. What do we do now? She asked, her voice trembling but resolute. We decide what justice looks like, Jack said, holding Nate's letter. Take this to Caldwell. Let the law handle it. Abigail nodded, her resolve hardening like steel in a forge. I want the truth out. Silas wasn't a saint. He was a monster, and I'm done letting this town pretend otherwise. The next day, Abigail rode to town, her chin high, her eyes blazing. She delivered the letter to Caldwell, who read it with a grim nod. Nate and his accomplices were arrested by sundown, their drunken confessions in the rusty spur, sealing their fate. Abigail returned to the ranch lighter, but raw, the weight of years of silence lifted. It's done, she told Jack, her voice steady. The truth's out. Over the next days, Abigail changed. She donated part of her wealth to a widow's fund, saying blood money's got to do good. Her walls fell, her touches lingering on Jack's arm, her smiles unguarded like sunlight breaking through clouds. Jack felt his own fears stir. Love was a risk he hadn't taken since Mary, a leap he wasn't sure he could survive. With 3 days left in the challenge, Tempest was ready to ride. Jack hesitated, knowing success meant facing a choice: stay or leave. That evening, Abigail found him at the corral, the stars bright above them. We need to talk, she said, her voice soft but firm, about what happens when you win. Jack waited, his heart pounding, the harmonica heavy in his pocket. You didn't break Tempest, she said, stepping closer. You earned him. You gave me hope, Jack. I love you. His walls crumbled, the grief he had carried loosening its grip. I love you too, Abigail, he said, his voice rough with emotion. More than I thought I could. Then stay, she said, her hand finding his, her eyes searching his face. Be my partner, not just with Tempest, but with this ranch with me. What about folks who'll say I quit? Jack asked, half smiling. Abigail grinned, her eyes sparking with defiance. Let's show 'em. A big exhibition, the whole territory invited. Prove what you've done with Tempest. Let 'em see what trust can build. And after Jack asked, his voice soft, hopeful. We plan our wedding, she said, pulling him close and kissing him fiercely, the stars bearing witness. But Nate Carver had other plans. Released on bail, he watched from a ridge overlooking the ranch, his rifle gleaming in the moonlight. He'd lost everything, reputation, freedom, because of Jack's arrival and Abigail's defiance. Killing Jack wasn't enough. Nate had heard whispers of a gold cache hidden on the Henshaw Ranch, stolen from a stagecoach years ago by Silas, and buried in a cave known only to a few. If he could frame Jack's death as an accident, pin it on Tempest, he'd search the ranch while Abigail grieved, claiming the gold and vanishing to Mexico. He'd hired 3 outlaws from Juarez hardmen with dead eyes and fast guns to ensure his plan succeeded. The exhibition would be their stage, and a brewing sandstorm would be their cover. The morning of the event, Bitter Creek buzzed with anticipation, the air thick with the scent of sage and the rumble of an approaching storm. Hundreds gathered around the corral, from ranch hands in dusty hats to territorial officials in starched collars, their wagons lining the road like a caravan of hope. Dark clouds churned on the horizon, promising chaos, but the crowd's excitement held firm. Jack led Tempest out the Stallion, calm and proud, his coat gleaming despite the gathering gloom. Mornin', folks, Jack called, his voice carrying over the wind. Ain't no tricks here, just trust hard-earned and true. He demonstrated Tempest's transformation. Voice commands that turned the Stallion's head, grooming that drew sighs from the crowd, saddling that went smoother than silk. When Jack mounted, the crowd held its breath, the air crackling with tension. Tempest moved like a dream, responding to Jack's lightest touch, his hooves dancing in perfect rhythm. They circled the corral, Tempest's stride joyful, their partnership a living testament to patience and respect. The crowd roared, hats flying into the air, their cheers drowning out the distant thunder. As Jack dismounted, a rifle cracked sharp and deadly. The bullet grazed his shoulder, blood blooming through his shirt. Chaos erupted, men shouting, women screaming, but Tempest didn't bolt. He stood over Jack, shielding him with his massive frame, his eyes blazing with defiance. Abigail ran to Jack, her hands shaking as she pressed his wound, her voice fierce. Stay with me, Jack. You're not leaving me. I'm fine. He gasped, his face pale but his eyes steady. Just a scratch. Caldwell scanned the ridge, his hand on his revolver. Nate Carver saw his rifle flash up there. Jack struggled to his feet, blood dripping into the dust. This is mine to settle. You're hurt, Abigail said, her voice breaking. Let Caldwell handle it. He tried to kill me in front of you, Jack said, his voice steel, his eyes burning with resolve. I'm ending this. I'm coming, Abigail insisted, her jaw set. Nate's poisoned this land too long. We finish this together. They mounted Jack on Sage Abigail on her bay mare Tempest, following without a lead, his loyalty fierce as the storm gathering strength. Caldwell joined them, his deputy trailing behind as they tracked Nate to a canyon where the sandstorm was brewing, the wind howling like a banshee, the air thick with red dust that stung their eyes and choked their lungs. Nate lay in wait, his three outlaws hidden in the rocks, their rifles trained, their shadows flickering in the swirling haze. "Drop your weapons," Nate shouted, emerging from the dust, his rifle raised, his eyes wild with desperation. His men stepped forward, their guns gleaming, their faces hard as the canyon walls. Jack's hand hovered near his revolver, his shoulder bleeding, his face set like stone. "You're a fool, Nate. This ends with you in chains." Nate laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Or you dead and me rich with Silas's gold. That cash is mine, Colton. You and your horse ain't stopping me." Tempest snorted, sensing danger, his ears pinned back. Before Nate could fire, the stallion charged, his hooves thundering, knocking one outlaw into the rocks with a sickening crunch. Jack drew his shot, dropping the second man, the bullet clean through his shoulder. Abigail dove from her mare, tackling the third outlaw, her fury unleashed as she pinned him, her knee on his chest until Caldwell cuffed him. Nate fired wildly, the bullet grazing Tempest's flank, drawing a thin line of blood. The stallion reared screaming, but didn't flee, his eyes locked on Jack. Jack dove for Nate, tackling him into the sand, the storm's dust choking their lungs. They grappled, fists flying, blood mixing with dirt, until Jack pinned him, his fist raised, his voice a growl. "Enough." Nate sneered, his face twisted with hate. "You'll never find that gold, Colton. It's buried deeper than your grave." Abigail stepped forward, her voice cold as the wind. "I don't want it. Blood money stays buried." Caldwell hauled Nate up the storm, easing the dust settling like a curtain falling. "You're done, Carver," he said, cuffing him. "The law's waiting." Nate's men confessed under pressure, revealing the gold's location, a cave on the ranch, hidden behind a false wall filled with coins and bars, stolen from a stagecoach Silas had ambushed years ago. Abigail donated it to the widow's fund, saying, "Let it do good for once, not evil." 6 months later, the Colton Henshaw Ranch thrived, its fences strong, its fields green with new growth. Jack and Abigail married in a ceremony attended by half the territory, Tempest adorned with ribbons, his coat gleaming under the sun. The ranch became a sanctuary, training horses with Jack's methods and healing souls with Abigail's compassion. Jack worked with a new Mustang, his patience unchanged, while Abigail taught women like Sarah Boone, a survivor of abuse, to find strength in horses to rebuild what had been broken. As evening fell, Jack and Abigail sat on their porch, the mountains glowing purple in the distance, Tempest grazing nearby. "Regrets?" she asked, her hand in his. "Only that it took so long to find you," Jack said, his voice soft, his eyes warm. Tempest nickered, a sound of peace, blessing the life they'd built from dust and dreams, a testament to trust, love, and the strength to rise from ashes.